before it happened and after it happened. Before the phone call, before the conversation, before the truth surfaced. And then after trust cracked, after vows felt fragile, after the person you thought would protect your heart became the one who wounded it. And some pain bursts loudly, right? But the deepest pain often arrives quietly. It's the slow realization that something sacred has been broken. It's looking at someone who once felt safe and realizing something has shifted. It's discovering that what you once believed was secure wasn't. In 2009, the world watched one of those before and after moments unfold. Only this one happened on television screens and front pages. Tiger Woods was at the height of his career. If you followed sports you remember he wasn't just winning, he was dominating. Every tournament felt like a foregone conclusion. Sponsors lined up, cameras followed him everywhere. His name just wasn't attached to golf, it was golf. He had built a reputation on discipline and focus and precision, and he looked steady and controlled and almost untouchable. And from the outside, his family appeared just as polished. He and Ellen Nordegren had seemed to have the kind of life that most people quietly envy. Success and wealth and beautiful children and influence, the kind of picture that makes you assume that everything behind the scenes must be as strong as it looks on the stage. But then scandal broke. Not a rumor, not a small misstep. Infidelity, repeated betrayal, headlines that would not go away. For weeks, it was everywhere. News coverage, talk shows, jokes, commentary, analysis. Everybody had an opinion. Everyone had something to say. But beneath all the noise was something far more human. A wife blindsided, children caught in the fallout, a family fractured. Later, interviews describe that moment of discovery as disorienting, like the ground beneath her feet had shifted. That's the language that stuck with me. The ground shifted. Because betrayal does that. It shakes what you thought was solid. Trust, which had once just been there, solid and unquestioned, suddenly wasn't so anymore. Conversations from the past started sounding different in your mind. Things that once felt normal now felt suspicious. Memories had to be replayed and moments had to be rethought. You find yourself asking, well, was that real, right? Did I miss something? And what used to feel solid now feels shaky. And here's what fame couldn't fix. When something sacred breaks, it breaks the same way for everybody. Money doesn't soften betrayal. Prestige doesn't make the pain go away. Popularity doesn't make it easier. Public administration does not shield you from it, or public admiration, I should say, does not shield you from it. In fact, in their case, the private pain became a public spectacle. And what should have been dealt with quietly became fodder for strangers. And that only made it worse. That only magnified the wound. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about a golfer. It was about broken promises. And when promises break, whether you live in a mansion or you live in a modest home, the ache still feels the same. That's what makes this so personal. Not the celebrity, not the headlines, but the reality that when promise is violated, something deep inside a person trembles. And some of you know exactly what that feels like. One blogger wrote, you can survive a car accident and wear a cast. You can have surgery and show a scar, but betrayal leaves inside wounds. And here's what struck me as that story unfolded. People weren't just talking about a celebrity scandal. They were talking about their own marriages, right? Their own disappointments, their own secrets, because betrayal is not rare. It's universal. And probably none of you experienced it under flashing cameras, but you have experienced maybe. Some of you watching this online, you know what I'm talking about. You You've experienced this, a spouse who broke a vow, a friend who shared what you had confided, a business partner who misused your trust, a parent who walked away. And when trust shatters, something inside you trembles. And the real damage isn't just what happened out there, it's what starts happening in here. You begin second-guessing yourself. You replay conversations. You question their judgment. You guard your heart a little tighter next time. Because betrayal doesn't just damage a relationship, it shakes your sense of security. And that kind of pain feels deeply personal. That's why this series is entitled Nothing Personal, right? Not because life isn't personal, but because of so much of what wounds us does not have to define us. In this series, we're learning how to respond differently when everything in us wants to take it personally and let it shape our future. And today, I want to look into one of the most personal wounds that people carry. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 through 32, during the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses divorce, and you can read it there. But if you listen carefully, you will realize that he isn't merely addressing legal paperwork. He's addressing broken promises and fractured trust and wounded hearts. In the first century, divorce had become something that could be initiated for almost any reason. And what God had designed as covenant had been reduced to a certificate. What was supposed to be special and permanent and sacred had become disposable. And Jesus does something remarkable. He does something remarkable. He raises the seriousness of broken vows, not to shame people, but to remind us of the covenant that it matters. Covenant matters. It matters deeply to the heart of God, because every broken covenant, behind every broken covenant is a story. Behind every signed document is a tear. Behind every it just didn't work out is a wound. And long before Jesus spoke those words, David poured his own heartbreak into Psalm 55. If you want to find both of those passages, Matthew 5 and Psalm 55, you can look at both of those. Listen to his anguish there. He says, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend. That's the sharpest pain of all. Not opposition from a stranger, but betrayal from someone close. And so here's the question underneath both passages, beneath the headlines, beneath his history, beneath your own story. What do I do when I hurt? Can you just write that in the margin of your Bible? What do I do when I hurt? Because here's the big idea today. I want you to see this. Hurt doesn't heal by being ignored. It heals when it is brought into the light and surrendered to Jesus. Look at that again, right? Hurt doesn't heal by being ignored. It heals when it is brought into the light and surrendered to Jesus. Folks, you can bury it, you can deny it, you can spiritualize it, you can weaponize it, but it will not disappear. Jesus doesn't ignore how serious broken trust really is. And David doesn't pretend he's fine. He says out loud what his heart was actually feeling. And when you put those two together, you begin to see a way forward. So I want us to walk through this kind of slowly, not as a lecture, not as theory, but as something very real, something that helps us deal with all of the hurts. And maybe as you're watching this isn't your issue right now. Maybe your marriage is steady. Maybe your friendships are strong. But I promise you, someone close to you is carrying this kind of pain. A friend, a sibling, a coworker. And what we talk about today may be the very thing that helps you point them towards Jesus, towards real, lasting healing. Because at the end of the day, that's the question that we're carrying. What do I do with the hurt? I want to try to talk about this and not just throw out 4 quick fixes. Preachers sometimes do that, right? But maybe I could just offer some responses, some how-tos. How do we deal with the hurt? Let me give you 3 decisions that we can make when hurt shows up in our lives. Not steps to rush through, not secret sauce formulas, but responses that slowly God might use to bring us towards healing. Here's the first one. The first one is this: tell the truth about the wound. Let me say it this way: you cannot heal what you refuse to name. And many of us, without even realizing it, we're trained to minimize our pain. We learn to say things like, it's fine, it doesn't matter, I'm over it, God is in control. We're used to saying things like that. And sometimes those words are deeply faith-filled, but sometimes they maybe aren't completely the truth, right? Sometimes they really are an expression of trust, but sometimes they're a mask. Sometimes they're fake. Because pain that isn't acknowledged doesn't disappear. It just finds another way out. It leaks into your tone. It shows up in sarcasm. It comes out as defensiveness. It spills into your relationships. It taints how you hear people and how you respond to them. If you have your Bibles open to Psalm 55, I want you to look at that passage again. I think about Psalm 55. David doesn't do that in Psalm 55. He doesn't clean up his emotions to sound spiritual. He says plainly, look at that. He says, my heart is in anguish within me. It is in anguish within me. That word anguish carries the idea of twisting and writhing pain. David here talks about fear and trembling. He says horror has overwhelmed him. That's not dramatic language, folks. That's just honest language. It's not weak faith. That's honest faith. And the Bible gives us permission to pray like that. Psalm 62 verse 8 says, pour out your heart before him. The Hebrew there literally means to spill out, to empty it out, to gush it out. God is not asking for polished prayers. He is inviting us to bring the whole thing, the raw thing, the unfiltered thing. So tell the truth about that. I once spoke with a man who told me that he was completely past his divorce. He said it very calmly, very confidently, very emphatically, but every time marriage came up, there was an edge in his voice. Every mention of trust carried suspicion. He wasn't healed, he was guarded. You see, the wound hadn't been named, it had just been managed. And so here's what I'm trying to say. Healing begins when we stop pretending. So let me ask you very gently, you're watching this online, what actually hurt? Was it the betrayal? Was it the silence? Was it the humiliation? Was it the abandonment? Was it the promise that wasn't kept? Be specific. Be specific, because until you name it, it quietly shapes you. It sits in the background and influences how you see everything. So be specific. If you need to, pause this sermon and take a moment and write that down. Be specific. And then if you can, turn it back on and listen to the rest of the message. Acknowledging the wound is not weakness, it's courage. And the first step towards freedom is being honest. But that's only the beginning. Here's the second thing. Write this down, right? Don't let the hurt rewrite who you are. Tell the truth about the wound. Don't let the hurt rewrite who you are. Listen, when trust is broken, something inside of us takes a hit. Not just your heart, but our sense of who we are. Betrayal doesn't just hurt, it tries to tell a story about you, often a story that isn't true. It says things like, you weren't enough, or you should have seen it coming, or you will always be alone, or this is your fault. Those words come out. And listen, if you don't face those whispers, they quietly become your inner voice, shaping how you see yourself and how you move through the world. Think about Taylor Swift. But before we go any further, let me just tell you, I can barely believe that I'm using a Taylor Swift illustration, but she fits the idea. Taylor Swift, her life is lived in the public eye. Every relationship, every heartbreak, every betrayal, millions of people watched all of her life unfold. And yet behind the headlines, behind the music and the awards, there's a very real human story. Trust broken, promises unmet, moments where she had to wrestle with her own identity. How do you process betrayal when it's not private? But it's magnified by everyone around you. When the world questions your choices and the pain whispers that maybe it's your fault, that's the power of betrayal. It wants to rewrite your story even when you know your value hasn't changed. What does Taylor Swift do about it? Well, she writes songs about it. She's really honest about it in her songs. And along the way, she's become a cajillionaire. But she doesn't let that rewrite who she is. Her life is lived in the public eye, right? Everybody sees all of that. But David modeled this in a different way in Psalm 55. Go back to Psalm 55, if you will. He's shaken. He's betrayed by someone close. And yet what does he do? He keeps talking to God. He pours out his anguish, trembling and overwhelmed, but he refuses to let the betrayal rewrite his relationship with God. Jesus does the same thing in Matthew chapter 5. He addresses sin seriously. He confronts brokenness, but he never strips dignity from the person. He takes the wound seriously without redefining worth. And so here's what I'm trying to say. Friends, you are not your divorce. You are not your abandonment. You are not your family dysfunction. You are not what somebody else did to you. Listen, write this down. What happened to you is not who you are. But here's the danger. If you don't hang on to that truth, right, your past will start shaping your present. It's like I said last week, a delayed response feels like rejection. A disagreement feels like abandonment. A boundary feels like betrayal. That old hurt starts reading your relationship for you, how you see and react to everything, and letting it have that much control over your life is way too heavy a burden to carry. And so that brings us to the next step. The next step, learning how to release what we cannot control. Because if betrayal and disappointment are allowed to keep describing your life, they will steal your peace. In other words, it's time to let go of the things that we cannot change, and it's time to place them into the hands of the only one who can carry them without being crushed. So get this third thing down. Place what you can't fix into God's hands. Place what you can't fix into God's hands. This may be the hardest part of all. Some hurts never heal. Some apologies never come. Some conversations never happen. You can't force repentance. You can't rewrite history. You can't control another person's heart, but you can decide what you will carry. You can decide what you will own. David writes in Psalm 55, verse 22, he says this, look at that, verse 22, cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. That word cast there means to throw it, to hand it over, to transfer the weight. Listen, forgiveness doesn't mean saying that it didn't matter. It means saying that I will not let it poison me. Releasing isn't excusing it, it's choosing freedom. And so what I'm trying to say is this, is when you hand your hurt to Jesus, you are placing it into the only hands strong enough to hold it without being crushed. And that changes you from the inside out. And it doesn't magically erase the pain, but it can free your heart to start rebuilding. I need to wrap this sermon up, but let me close with one last story. Sometime back, I got an email from an old friend, someone who I had walked with in ministry for many, many years, someone who I had supported and loved and dearly enjoyed working with. And for reasons that I still wrestle with, at one point, he turned against me, caused real pain, honestly, for Christy and I. And then out of the blue, he reached out. He reached out wanting to reconnect, wanting to, in his words, wanting to leave the water under the bridge. Here's the truth. I can do that. I can leave the water under the bridge. I will do that. I will leave the water under the bridge, and I'll do that all with grace. But I also know that true healing comes sometimes, it requires honest, candid conversation. Grace doesn't mean pretending that pain didn't happen. Grace means acknowledging it, bringing it into the light, inviting dialogue. That's exactly what Jesus modeled for us. And that's what David models at the end of Psalm 55. Look at the very end of verse 23. At the very end, he doesn't end in panic. He doesn't end in despair. He says, but as for me, what? I trust in you. That's peace. That's peace, not because nothing happened, but because he placed it in God's hands. When you bring the wound into the light, when you refuse to let it define you, when you surrender what you cannot control, when you move forward with wisdom, listen, what once felt overwhelming begins to loosen its grip. And the hurt that felt so personal no longer has to own your future.
All right, church, will you stand with us as we